All right, it is 7:30. Let's turn the music down a little bit. Let's get over here to the main screen, and I'm going to say good evening, everybody. How we doing tonight? It is time for our live review. I got a couple windows going here on my display here, so give me a second to get everything set up. I hope you guys are doing well tonight. We got everything ready to go. We're going to go into time period 3, in which we're going to talk from 1754, which is essentially the French and Indian War, and we're going to go all the way through John Adams' presidency, right up to 1800 and the election of Thomas Jefferson. Let me adjust this light here a little bit. All right, so we got a bunch of people in here already, so I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to go ahead and change my screen and get to the PowerPoint. It's going to look a little funky at first, so give it a second. And let me pull this up, and hopefully you guys got a good view. Yeah, okay. So I think that's working. If not, I'll adjust it here in a few minutes. Let me move this over here and take a look at it. Yeah, we're good to go. And way ahead there where we want to start. All right, so we are in time period 3. This is what we're going to be discussing, and it is all messed up. There we go. Yeah, you guys can't see that at all. Let me fix this for you. I apologize. Like I said, this has been going back and forth all night, and trying to get this stupid thing to work has been ticking me off. So let me see if I can adjust this a little bit. Get this over here. Actually, I'm going to move this screen over here. Talk amongst yourselves. What was your favorite part of this time period that we studied? Go ahead and throw it in the chat while I get my windows all set up here. Goodness gracious me. Can I move it here? There we go. That'll work. I think that's going to work for us. All right, so you got it here on the screen. I got this going here. I got the chat. No one put anything in the chat. That's okay. We're going to go ahead and get started. And tonight, while we look at this time period 3, there's a couple things I want you to remember. As I said, we're starting from the French and Indian War, and we're going all the way through Adams' presidency. So I've lost something here. There we go. All right, so we're going to start. Essentially, when you look at time period 3, it covers from 1754 to 1800. The big focus, obviously, is going to be the American Revolution, America gaining her independence. But in doing that, we're going to face a lot of new challenges, and how we deal with those challenges is going to be very interesting. We are going to develop our political system. We're going to go into the constitutional era. And as a result of that, you're going to see the development of our first two-party system. Now, I got a number of names there that you might want to be familiar with as far as people, that we talk about and stuff like that. Obviously, George Washington is a big one. Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Paine is in there as well, Jefferson. So all these people are people that you need to be familiar with going into this exam. Now, as I go through all the big ideas tonight, as I start talking about this stuff, remember, we are preparing for a test where you are going to apply your knowledge. This is not like a fact-based exam that you take. AP tests are not that way. What they do is they give you documents, they give you not prompts, but they give you stimulus through different documents and cartoons and charts and graphs and all that other stuff, and you have to apply the knowledge to those stimuli. And so what I'm talking about tonight is the basic knowledge you have to do. What you have to do on the exam is apply that knowledge through the series of the multiple choice test, multiple choice questions, as well as the short answer question. So if you guys are ready, we're going to go ahead and get started, and we are going to start with big idea number 1. Now, big idea number 1 essentially says that the French and Indian War is going to lead to increased land for the American colonies and also a greater burden of taxation. Now, when we look at the French and Indian War, what you have to understand is the cause of this war was essentially England and France encroaching on the Ohio River Valley. Ohio River Valley, very high. The desire for that land was very high due to the fact that it's very fertile, it's very rich in natural resources, and so, of course, everybody wants access to that land. What's going to happen is the French have already claimed it, but they're going to start to see some challenges coming from England and coming from the colonists as well, because the colonists are going to start moving out into that area. What you're going to see happening is the the Native Americans and the French are going to start doing a little pushback against the colonists. Remember, the Native American alliances that the French built back in the 1600s are still in play today. So what you're going to see happen is that as colonists start to move into the Ohio River Valley, they're going to get pushback from the French and from the Native Americans. One way they tried to combat this was through what was called the Albany Plan of Union. Benjamin Franklin is going to introduce this at an intercolonial government meeting that took place in Albany, New York. And the idea behind this was we can all get into this together. We can effectively recruit troops from the colonies and use tax dollars that is being raised in the colonies, because each of the colonies were imposing taxes on their citizens, take some of those tax dollars, raise a continental army, and use that to basically protect the colonists from the French and the Native Americans. England was all for that because that's going to save them the trouble of sending over a lot of troops to take part in all of this. The problem was the colonies didn't want to do it. The colonies did not want to give up their tax dollars in order to form this alliance, if you will, between the 13 colonies. So the Albany Plan of Union is going to fail. However, it sets a precedent going forward of this idea of a future alliance or a future unification of the colonies. So that's why the Albany Plan of Union is so important. It's not because it worked. It's because it gave us an example of what we could attain later. Now, the French and Indian War, we're not going to harp on that a lot. The English win. The English are going to send their troops over. It was part of this huge global conflict that was occurring, but it was part of that global conflict was being fought here in North America. And I think it's important to remember that England and France were involved in this global conflict. This was not just an isolated incident, an isolated tension between England and France. This has been going on for some time. The French and Indian War was essentially the end of the Second Hundred Years' War. When the war ends, the Treaty of Paris of 1763 is going to be signed. That is going to effectively get France completely out of the colonial region, completely out of North America, and now England has control of the lands going all the way west to the Mississippi River. Well, the colonists had fought alongside the English in defeating the French and their Native American allies. So once this war was over, the colonists were celebrating their victory. And one of the ways they're going to do this is expansion into the Ohio River Valley. You're going to start to see colonists flood into the Ohio River Valley, seeking some of that rich, fertile soil and the natural resources that are available to them out there. Well, one group of people who are not too happy with the colonists coming out is going to be the Native Americans. The Native Americans have just lost their number one ally in the French. They don't know what kind of ally they have at this point with Great Britain, so they're trying to figure it all out. And here come all these pesky colonists coming in and basically, coming into their lands and taking over their resources. This is going to lead to a Native American pushback called Pontiac's Rebellion. And Pontiac's Rebellion, Chief Pontiac was an Ottawa Native American, and he is going to bring several tribes together to try to combat the English and the colonists going forward. And they're going to actually lead a coordinated attack against the English and the colonists, in the Great Lakes region is where most of this fighting took place. Well, the rebellion's going to be put down, but England realizes that this is just going to be one in many problems that is going to come up with the Native Americans. So they have to take action to prevent any more Native American uprisings. That's where the Proclamation Line of 1763 comes in. The Proclamation Line essentially established a geographical boundary between the colonies and the western frontier. And they drew this geographical line right along the Appalachian Mountains. And essentially what the British said was, colonists, you have to stay on the east side of the line. Native Americans, they're not coming over here, so everything is good. Everything is copacetic. We can all just get along. All this land out here is for you. And that seemed to be the solution to the problem that the British were facing. Except what we're seeing is Great Britain, this is really the first step into Great Britain establishing, or I should say reestablishing, their authority in the colonies. And that's essentially going to take us to big idea number 2. And big idea number 2 says that the British colonial policies, specifically taxation without colonial representation in Parliament, is going to lead to the Revolutionary War. So what we're getting to here is the causes that led us to go to war with Great Britain. I'm going to be honest with you. The colonists weren't too excited with the proclamation line of 1763, especially those colonists who wanted to move west. Well, they're upset with it, but let's be honest. Most colonists could care less about this line because they have their lives throughout the rest of the colonies, and that little bit of land that separates them from the proclamation line, it really hasn't even been inhabited yet. So this proclamation line, though a little bit of an annoyance, it wasn't a deal breaker, okay? Keep that in mind going forward. So when we get into big idea number 2, we're going to deal with another problem that existed from the French and Indian War, and that was this debt that England had incurred fighting here in North America. England already had debt because they'd been fighting in the Second Hundred Years' War, but what they spent over here was incredible. And when they spent all that money here, essentially getting rid of the French and defending the colonists, in their view, from French incursion or Native American incursion, they looked to the colonists and said, hey, listen, we just spent a lot of money on you guys over here. Maybe it's time you accept some of your fiscal responsibility in all this. And so they are essentially going to end salutary neglect. Now, you should remember salutary neglect was the process, or not the process, but the policy, the unofficial policy that Britain was enforcing here in the colonies. They had laws. They had passed the Navigation Acts in the 1600s. They just weren't enforcing the laws in the colonies. And over 150 years of the colonial existence, they had allowed self-governments to be established. They had allowed, 150 years, we're talking at least 7 or 8 generations of colonists established themselves as their own political community. And now all of a sudden, here comes Great Britain and says, we need some more from you. We need money. And so they pull back salutary neglect. They're going to start reinforcing the Navigation Acts because they said, smuggling's kind of been a problem. That's kind of been a drain on our economy. And they're going to start passing some taxes. The first tax they pass is the Sugar Act. Not that big a deal. I'm going to be honest with you. It was just an extension of the Molasses Act from 1739. And they even lowered the debt, or lowered the tax. And really the only people paying the sugar tax was merchants. So this one didn't get a lot of pushback from the colonists. Where you're really going to see that happen is in 1765 with the enactment of the Stamp Act. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would they put a tax on stamps? And this is where I say, it wasn't a tax on stamps like postage stamps. It was a tax on all legal documents in the colonies. And why it's called the Stamp Act is you had to, when you paid the tax for that paper that you're buying, they put a stamp on it. They embossed a stamp on it to show you paid the tax. So please, please, please don't talk about mail or postage when you're talking about the Stamp Act. The two don't line up. But what does line up is the colonial anger with the Stamp Act. This is when the all-important statement of no taxation without representation becomes very popular. The colonists are saying, how can you tax us? We have no representation in Parliament. We have no voice in government that is making these decisions. And of course, the the Parliament is going to swear up and down, you are represented. You have virtual representation, meaning that every single member of Parliament, when they take office, they say, listen, we are going to support, we are going to represent every single English citizen, no matter where they live. So colonists, go blow sand. We do represent you. well, that ain't going to handle it. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see protests starting to rise up. And there's going to be a lot of different types of protests against some of the acts that are passed, some of the taxes from the legislative actions they take. Probably the number one is the Sons and the Daughters of Liberty, because we all know about tar and feathering. But this was just one part of the colonial protest movement. As other taxes come in, like the Townsend Act and the Tea Act, stuff like that, you're going to see other forms of protesting other than the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. But since we're on that topic, what type of protests did they did? Well, they held rallies. They did tar and feather, or they threatened tax collectors. The Daughters of Liberty organized boycotts, stopped buying British goods, and all that kind of stuff. So that they do play a huge role in the colonial pushback to the taxation and legislation of Parliament. But that wasn't all that happened. The other things you start to see happen is the Congresses are going to be formed. The Stamp Act Congress is going to be formed in response to that one tax. And that was, I believe, you don't need to know the number, I think it was like 27 representatives from different colonies who came together and issued a request or a petition to Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. And they laid out the reasons why they thought the Stamp Act should be repealed. But what's important is that they weren't pushing for independence in 1765. There was no mention of independence in 1765. They just didn't want to pay the tax. And so they said, please just take this tax away and we'll be happy and we'll be friends again and we'll stop protesting and we'll put the tar away and all that other jazz. My notes are falling down, sorry. So the other thing that you're going to see happen is, as a result of the Stamp Act, is and all the other stuff going on, but Parliament is going to repeal the Stamp Act. Honestly, guys, it's kind of like teaching a dog a bad habit. If you reward someone for doing something that you don't like, they're going to just keep doing it. So in repealing the Stamp Act, I think Parliament taught the colonists, hey, if you protest enough, we'll just pull back. We're not going to stand behind our word. We're not going to stand behind these great ideas that we have. But what they did do is they passed the Declaratory Act. It was kind of that, aha moment, in your face, colonists, because the Declaratory Act in 1766 basically said we can pass whatever law we want. We might have repealed this tax. That doesn't mean we won't pass another tax, because we're Parliament and we can do what we want and you're English citizens, so deal with it. And then things were kind of quiet for a little bit. And then, of course, the Townsend Act came up. And the Townsend Act was a tax on all sorts of stuff like paper and lead and glass and tea, all of that. Well, guess who comes back? The Sons of Liberties come back. The Daughters of Liberty come back. And they start, again, boycotting British goods. And the value of this boycott can't be overlooked. Because as they boycotted British goods, the people that were hurt the most by this is British merchants. The folks sending all those goods over here. They're the ones who are going to get the ear of Parliament. They're the ones who are going to Parliament saying, hey, all these taxation laws that you're enacting, it's costing us a ton of money. Stop it. And so as a result of that, you will see some of these taxes repealed. But Parliament is concerned with what's going on in the colonies. They feel like they're losing control. And so as a result of the proclamation line, as a result of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty and all that stuff, they're going to start upping the military presence in the colonies. And in order to keep the military there, the military has to have a place to live. So you're going to see quartering acts being installed. Quartering acts basically say, hey, listen, we're sending soldiers over. They need a place to live, and your house has been chosen. And just like that, you have a soldier living with you. You have to feed him. You have to do his laundry. You have to clean up after him. It's kind of like having, your little brother come to visit. And you didn't want him to come, but there he is. So that's kind of what's going on with the soldiers and with the Quartering Act. And what really upsets the colonists about this is the fact that they have a standing army in the colonies and they're not at war. Because it was traditional. When wars came to an end, armies went away. You never saw the military. And now the colonists are seeing them on their streets and stuff like that. And that's going to lead to some agitation, specifically in Boston. And I'm talking, of course, about the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre is important, not because it necessarily accomplished anything, but it's going to be the first time that, the first time that blood is shed over all of this. Colonial blood is going to be shed. 5 colonists are going to be killed by British soldiers when there's a confrontation between an angry crowd and a squad of British soldiers. And this is going to be, man, it's just going to be broadcast all over the colonies with Paul Revere's engraving. If you remember correctly, he did that engraving that was pure propaganda. The presentation presented a picture that was completely different than what actually happened. But it got colonists started thinking, if it happened there, can it happen here? And what's going on up in Boston? And why all of a sudden are English troops firing on English citizens? All those questions started coming to the forefront. After the Boston Massacre, there was a relative time of quiet. We're going to go several years without anything major happening. But what's going to happen in 1773 is the Tea Act is going to be passed. The Tea Act was a monopoly on tea from the British East India Trading Company. And they essentially told the colonists, all you can do is buy our tea. You don't get a choice. And if you want to tick off a future American, because that's what they are at this point, tell us we don't have a choice. And I told my class, and I'll tell you guys if you're listening too, the tea they were selling was really high quality tea. And they were selling it for a lot less than what they are paying for tea in the colonies already. But the colonies say, hey, no, we want a choice. I know you're selling us high quality, inexpensive tea, but I want the ability to be able to buy crappy, expensive tea. So don't take away my choice. They're going to protest this. And this is what leads to the Boston Tea Party. And the Boston Tea Party, my opinion, is more of a catalyst towards the American Revolution than the massacre was. We tend to focus on the massacre, well, just because it has that name, massacre. I mean, massacre versus party. I mean, you tell me which one is more insightful. But the Boston Tea Party, so much money was lost with that dumping of the tea into the harbor that now Parliament is angry. And I should mention that a lot of members of Parliament own stock in that trading company, so they're losing the money. This is going to lead to Parliament wanting to punish Boston, and they're going to pass the coercive acts, often referred to as the intolerable acts. And when you look at those acts include the Boston Port Act. They include another quartering act, the Massachusetts Governing Act, where they took away their right to self-government and they revoked their charter. The Quebec Act that opened up Canada to the French Canadians, those folks who lost the war, the ones who lost the French and Indian War, they're starting to get all the freedoms that they're taking away from the colonists in Boston. So the intolerable acts is going to lead to the first Continental Congress meeting. They're actually going to come together this time and say, this is something we all have to deal with. Yeah, the intolerable acts are happening in Boston, but what happens when they come to Charleston? Or what happens, when they come into Philadelphia or places like that? And so the first Continental Congress is going to come together. And what they're wanting to do is they want to resist these English colonial policies. So they're going to send a letter to the Parliament, that their Declaration of Rights and Grievances, but they're still holding on to the idea that they want to remain English citizens. They're not quite ready for that independence movement. But one thing they did in the First Continental Congress is they started kind of planning. They told the representatives at the Continental Congress, hey, go back to your colony, start kind of building up your militias, start kind of, stocking up on weapons. Hopefully we won't have to use them, but just in case, let's go ahead and do that. Well, what's going to happen is these militias are going to start developing, and with that, you're going to start seeing tension rise. Now, this is where I'm going to pause before I get to big idea number 3 and tell you, if I were you when I was studying, I would make a makeshift timeline of all these steps that led up to the American Revolution, because that will help you understand the mindset, how it started to change for the colonies. Because what's next in big idea number 3 is the influence of the Enlightenment is going to come in. The influence of the Enlightenment ideals is going to exhibit this major influence on the American independence movement. Now we're talking about an independence movement. And it's going to be really exhibited in Thomas Paine's Common Sense and then later the Declaration of Independence. Back in the 1730s, 1740s is when we had the Enlightenment movement. And these thinkers of the Enlightenment introduced us to these ideas of natural rights and the social contract and the separation of powers. And as the colonists are starting to live under what they consider an oppressive ruling or oppressive governing of Great Britain, they start thinking, well, what about our natural rights? Are they protecting those, or are they a threat to our natural rights? And just a quick reminder, I'm going to break it down really quickly just in case you don't remember. Natural rights, the right to life, liberty, and property, says that we are all endowed with certain rights by God and not government. Our rights don't come from government. These are rights that come from God that we were born with. So government can't take those rights away. And the colonists are feeling like some of these rights are slowly drifting away, especially that right to self-govern, I think, was a big one for them. And then this idea of a social contract, that the power of government actually lies in the hands of the people. We as citizens give the government the power to govern us. But under the social contract, if we don't feel like the government is protecting our natural rights, we have the right to essentially nullify that contract and replace that government. In fact, I think Thomas Jefferson, when he writes the Declaration of Independence, he says we not only have the right to do that, we have the duty to do that. And then, of course, separation of powers. Then the colonists have been under the thumb of Parliament up until this point, and they're thinking, man, maybe we need to divide up some of this power because they have way too much. 1776, well, what's going to happen in 1775 is you're going to see the English military presence start to grow, and they're going to start trying to take some, what's the word I'm looking for, proactive measures towards these militias that are rising up. And they're going to march towards Lexington and Concord with the purpose of trying to confiscate the armory, the weapons that the Massachusetts militia has built up and are hiding. They're going to meet the Massachusetts militia, and you're going to hear the first shots fired of the American Revolution, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the shot that was heard around the world. Because have you ever heard of a colony taking fire or shooting upon their mother country? Because that's exactly what's happening in North America. And Lexington and Concord is kind of going to be the unofficial start to the American Revolution. As a result of that, the Second Continental Congress is going to come together. They're going to make one last-ditch effort to bring peace between the colonies and Great Britain. That was the Olive Branch Petition. And the Olive Branch Petition is going to be sent to King George III at about the same time he hears about the devastation of his army at Bunker Hill. So when he hears that his army although they won the battle, they got kind of beat up. And then he reads the Olive Branch Petition. They don't mesh up, and he just rips up that Olive Branch Petition and declares that the colonies are in rebellion. He issued a proclamation of rebellion. This, in a sense, is a declaration of war. He says, because a proclamation of rebellion essentially gives the military a lot more power. They can put the colonies under martial law. So this, I think, is the beginning of the American Revolution, the official beginning. The colonists, the Second Continental Congress, when the Olive Branch Petition is rejected, they're going to take a cue from Thomas Paine, who in January of 1776 wrote Common Sense. And in Common Sense, in this pamphlet that was written for everybody, so it was easy to read, where he has references not only to the Enlightenment, but to the Bible as well. And he brings all those ideas together and says we have to declare our independence from Great Britain. And that's exactly what the Second Continental Congress is going to do when they vote to approve Richard Henry Lee's petition, or his act for independence. The Lee Resolution is the official Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson is tasked with writing up the physical form of the Declaration of Independence, a document for the colonies, a document to explain why they're declaring their independence, what complaints or grievances they have against the king, and what they're going to do going forward. So a lot of people like to say that the Declaration of Independence was this letter written to King George. Not the case. It was a letter, in a sense, written to the colonists saying, this is the decision that we made on your behalf, and this is why. And so now we're officially at war with Great Britain. So let's talk a little bit about that war. Big idea number 4 says that despite Britain's military and financial advantages, and they had a lot of them, the American patriots won the Revolutionary War and gained independence. I took an entire class on the American Revolution when I was getting my graduate degree. So for 5 months, we talked about nothing but the American Revolution. I'm going to talk about it for 5 minutes. Because what you really need to know is that we went up against the giant. Great Britain was the #1 country. They were the empire. And there's no way we should have won. And in the beginning, we were struggling. We were, these 13 colonies with a bunch of farmers fighting, and we didn't have any money or anything like that. But one battle is going to change all that, and that is the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. When that battle is won, France is going to join our fight. Going back to Lee's resolution, he said there's 3 things we need to do. Number 1, we need to declare independence. Number 2, we need to find some friends in the world, allies, if you will. And number 3, we need to create a government. Well, this is number 2. We found an ally in France. Benjamin Franklin had been over there, tickling their ear, saying, you need to join us, you need to join us. When we won the Battle of Saratoga, France is going to come in as our ally. They're going to bring Spain with them. France is going to provide men to fight. Their navy is huge. They're going to give us equipment. They're going to give us money. Spain is going to give us money. They're going to give us equipment, all this other stuff. This is the turning point of the war. The war is going to continue until 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown, when the British finally surrender. Like I said, I took a whole class on this, and maybe that's something you're looking forward to when you get to college, but for right now, that's what you need to know. The war ends with the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And that's going to essentially get England out of the colonial region, and now we're an independent nation. The war itself, I'm feeling a little guilty, so let me just backtrack a little bit. The war itself, going into it, it was hard for us because of the division in the colonies. You only had about 1/3 of the colonies who supported the revolution, the patriots. That's really the only support base you had. You had another third of people, the loyalists, who still supported Great Britain, and then you had another almost 40% of people who just didn't care. They just wanted to farm, and they wanted to live their lives, and so that made it a little difficult into this war. The one thing we had, though, that Great Britain didn't, if you want to line up everything, we had George Washington, and we had an incredible leader in George Washington, and he is going to essentially keep our armies together in the worst of times so that they could win in the best of times. So a little bit more on the American Revolution, but the bottom line is we won. America, we're good. And we're going to inspire others. The American Revolution actually inspired revolutions throughout the world. The big one is the French Revolution, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, but also the Haitian Revolution, the biggest slave uprising ever. And then in Latin America, you're going to see a number of revolutions against colonizing powers as well. So we were the OG. We were the ones who first did it, and we are going to set the precedent for others to follow going forward. Okay? All right, let's get to big idea number 5, because I've been doing this for over half an hour and we're not even halfway through. All right, so here we go. Richard Henry Lee said we also got to create a government. The government that they created in 1777 is going to be the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation were the very first Constitution of the United States, and it failed largely because the federal government that they created was much too weak. You got to think about it. When you're creating a government as you're fighting another one, the government you create, you want it to be completely opposite than what you already have. And that's kind of what the Articles were. What had happened is, as that we declared our independence, all these states, they re-upped and they wrote their own state constitutions. And when it came time to write the articles to create those, they're just going to copy state constitutions and take the best parts of each of those. What they created was a government that got us through the war. Yeah, good on us, but it wasn't a sustainable government. Excuse me just a second. So essentially, the Articles of Confederation set up a legislative branch that was one house. We call that a unicameral legislature, a one-house legislature. In that house, every single state had one vote. So we had equal representation in the House. There was no executive branch. There was no judicial branch. So when you look at the structure in itself was a weakness because we didn't have leadership. We had, 13 people trying to decide what was good for our country. And in order for them to get anything done, over 2/3 of them had to agree to make laws, and all of them had to agree if you wanted to change the laws. So it was very difficult. There was some success, like I said, they won the war, but the biggest success has to be the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance, essentially, what you had happening after the war ended, just like after the French Indian War, all the colonies were flooding out into the western part of the areas past the Appalachian Mountains. They did the same thing here, except this time the states started claiming all that land. And the government realized we need an organized way of bringing states into our country and organized way of dividing up the land and stuff like that. So they're going to establish the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Land Ordinance was established as a method to essentially divide up the land we have, creating, geographical lines to, basically breaking everything down into acres and how many acres go into a town and how many towns go into a county, stuff like that. They established all of that in the Land Ordinance of 1785. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 took that Ohio River Valley region and said, we are going to go ahead and implement a system to add more states to that region. They said they have to have at least 3 states in that region, but more so, we should have no more than 5 states in that region. And so that's what's going to happen with that. And the Northwest Ordinance is going to be created in order to bring in a systematic way of adding states to the Union. What's interesting, it changes just a little bit here, get my face out of the way. What's interesting is the one big thing that the Northwest Ordinance did that is probably the most successful part is they banned slavery in the Northwest region. No one had actually talked about banning slavery in our country at all, but they did it in the Northwest region. It was probably an easy thing to do since, there wasn't a whole lot of people living there and there wasn't a whole lot of plantations, but they did that while at the same time you saw a lot of the New England states and the northern states start to banish slavery in their states as well. So we have this government, we have, a way to bring land or bring states and everything in. So what really shone the light on the fact that this government really wasn't sustainable? That's going to be Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion of Western Massachusetts farmers who were dealing with the economic crisis that America was dealing with. After the war, we saw very high inflation. We had a lot of debt we had to pay, and we really didn't have a way to pay that debt. I should mention that the Articles of Confederation gave us no power to tax. So that's a weakness in the government. And these soldiers who are returning from the war with no money are finding that their homes and their farms are being foreclosed on because they can't pay off their loans. When that happens, led by Daniel Shays, a bunch of farmers, about 1,000 of them, are going to rebel against the Massachusetts government. It was right here in this moment that we realized, Houston, we have a problem. Because when the Massachusetts government, tries to call up the federal military, there is no federal military. There's no one to come and fight on behalf of the states. And so Massachusetts is going to have to hire a private army to put down this rebellion. Well, we realized at that point, things are not looking too good. So that's when some of the leaders of our country, like Washington and Hamilton, went to the Annapolis Convention. And the idea of the Annapolis Convention was, let's look at the Articles of Confederation and see what we can do to fix them. Well, the Annapolis Convention was a great idea, except for one thing. Hardly anybody showed up. So they said, we need to have a real convention where all the states show up. And so they planned to have the Constitutional Convention the next year in Philadelphia, in which all the states could attend. Which takes us to our next big idea number 6, which says the Constitutional Convention was called to draft a new constitution to rectify the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. We need to fix the mess we made. And they can't fix it. So they just are going to start all over again. Remember, the Articles of Confederation, weak because they lacked the power to tax. They couldn't raise an army. They couldn't regulate commerce. They had no executive branch, no judicial branch. These are just a few examples of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And they're like, we've got to do better. And so that's where the Constitution is going to come into play. The Constitutional Convention is often referred to as a bundle of compromises because a whole bunch of compromises were made to get to where we needed to be. The very first compromise was called the Great Compromise, and it had to do with representation. There was a big debate on how states should be represented. Should they be represented by population? Should they be represented equally? The big states said, population. The more people I have, the more power I have in Congress. The small states are like, no, not population, because we don't have very much. And if the big states have all the representatives, no one will ever hear us. And so what you have is the field is the debate about representation, but the argument is over power in Congress. And so essentially what the Great Compromise did was it took both of those plans and put them together. That is why today we have a bicameral legislature. Bicameral meaning 2 houses. The first house is the House of Representatives. In that house, every state is going to be represented based on their population. So the more people living in their state, the more representatives they're going to have. That gives the big states, the heavy populated states, an advantage in the House of Representatives. But don't lose faith. We're going to go over to the other side, the Senate, the second house. In the Senate, we are equally represented. Every state has 2 senators. That levels the playing field. That gives the smaller states a voice. And in all honesty, as our country has grown, there's more smaller states than there is large states. The crux of it is you need both houses in order to make legislation. In order to pass laws, both the House and the Senate have to approve. So while the House of Representatives gives the big states a louder voice, they can't control legislation because in the Senate, the smaller states essentially have a louder voice. So they have to come to agreement. They have to work together, which is essential for our government. If they're not working together, nothing ever can get done. Okay? So that's the first compromise. The second compromise is essentially who counts for population. So if you get more power, if you get more power, listen, Talia, don't waste my time. Hang on, let me do something real quick here. There we go. All right. So if we get more power, we have a louder voice. So this is when the debate over whether or not the slaves should count towards population. Obviously, slave states want them to count, but the non-slave states don't. The compromise they come up with is the 3/5 compromise. 3/5 of the slaves are going to count towards population. And in exchange for that, what we're going to do is we're going to put a moratorium or a deadline on the Atlantic slave trade. Atlantic slave trade. 20 years after this is ratified, the Atlantic slave trade will become illegal in the United States. So we had first the Great Compromise, now the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now the challenge is, how do we get this ratified? And this is when you're going to see the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist debate start to come up. I'm sorry, I jumped over some. I got thrown off there a little bit. I'm sorry. The other thing they created was the executive and the judicial branch. The executive branch will be the office of the president, and they debated on how we choose the president. The compromise there was the Electoral College. The Electoral College makes sure that every state has a voice in the presidential election. The electors that every state has is equal to the number of representatives and senators that they have. So if we have 20 representatives plus our 2 senators, that means we have 22 electoral votes. Okay? The debate over ratifying the Constitution is going to be between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists favored a strong central government. They wanted to ratify the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were concerned that the Constitution gave the federal government way too much power. So they don't want to ratify it. They just want to keep what we have. But they're also concerned because there's nothing in the Constitution about individual rights. So the compromise here is that the Anti-Federalists will support the Constitution if a Bill of Rights is added, if individual rights are added to the Constitution. And so when James Madison agrees, when he says, as soon as the Constitution is ratified, I will add individual rights to the Constitution, that got them over the hill and got the Constitution ratified. And true to his word, Madison will add the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Your individual rights, which include the right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of petition, freedom of assembly. That's your First Amendment right. The right to due process, the right to a speedy and fair trial, the right to protection against illegal search and seizure. All of that is listed in your Bill of Rights, which is really important. Another amendment that was very important in the Bill of Rights is the 10th Amendment, because what the 10th Amendment says is anything not listed in the Constitution becomes a power of the state governments. That brings us to that idea of federalism. Federalism was established in the Constitution, and federalism is when you divide power between a state and a federal government. And it's supposed to be equal division of power between the two. So federalism, one of those words, guys, you absolutely need to know going forward. The result of the Constitutional Convention, a much stronger government with 3 branches, and the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. Okay? Excuse me. All right, let's get to big idea number 7. Big idea number 7. The Constitution of the United States created a new central government defined by federalism and the separation of powers. I just actually already talked about that, but let me reiterate this idea. There are certain, not values, but construction within the Constitution that all come as a result of the failure of the Articles of Confederation as well as Enlightenment ideas. The idea of federalism actually came from the failure of the Articles of Confederation. Remember, the states had all the power under the Articles. Now it's divided power between the states and the federal government. Separation of powers, that came from the Enlightenment, from Montesquieu, I believe. Or was it Rousseau? Montesquieu. And this idea of dividing up power in government and setting up a system of checks and balances so one branch of the government cannot become too powerful. When you look at our Constitution, you're seeing the values of the Enlightenment really come to life, the application of it, if you will. So keep that in mind as you look at the structure of the U.S. Constitution. So we jump ahead to big idea number 8. Big idea number 8 says the ideals of the American Revolution affected society in America in terms of gender roles and debates about slavery, while they also inspired revolutions in France and Haiti. I touched on this just a few minutes ago with the inspiration of the revolutions, but let's talk a little bit about this is society after the American Revolution. One big thing is we've got this new country, we've created this new government. How do we, essentially educate the American public about it, because a government is only as strong as its people. Remember, this idea of republicanism is that the power of government belongs to the people. So public education is going to become a value of American society going forward. And with regards to sharing that education, women are going to become the conveyor of Republican ideals. The idea is called Republican motherhood. And what that essentially means is that women had influence in the family to teach their sons and daughters about politics. Their goal or their job in society is to raise their sons well versed in the Republican values that the Constitutional Convention and the Declaration of Independence, all of that established in our country. So education for women is going to become important. So women have to learn in order so they can teach their sons. And daughters are going to learn so they can, when they get married, they can also teach their sons. So I think Republican motherhood is one of the major effects on society that the revolution had. And like I said, you also had the effect on other countries, France and Haiti, and them finding their own fight for independence and building that fight off of what they learned from the American Revolution. So all of that is really important. And we did have a lot of influence. We still have a lot of influence today. But let's get to big idea number 9. Woo! We're getting towards the end, but we still got a lot to talk about. Here we go, big idea number 9. The presidencies of George Washington and John Adams set precedents for the way America would behave regarding the relationship between the federal government and state governments, economic policy, and foreign policy. George Washington, elected president of the United States. How do you be a president if you don't have anything to go off of? George Washington essentially had to establish the presidency, and he's going to do it quite well. The first thing he's going to do is surround himself with experts. He's going to create the first presidential cabinet, which will have departments of state, treasury, war, and also an attorney general. The people he surrounds himself with, well, the Treasury was run by Alexander Hamilton. The Department of War was run by Henry Knox. The Department of State was run by Thomas Jefferson. These are men that are experts in their field. And so he believed that having these men around him as advisors is going to help him build an executive branch and build a government that will make the best out of the Constitution that he was part of creating. One thing I want to throw out there, because a lot of people often don't realize this, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, they were not part of the Constitutional Convention. So don't try to stick them in there. They were off as foreign ministers. Adams was in England and Jefferson was in France. Okay, so that's just kind of a side note. During Washington's presidency, we are going to see the evolution of political parties. The Federalist Party is going to grow, and then you're also going to have the Democratic Republicans starting to grow. They're not officially parties during his presidency, but you're starting to see the split between these two big ideas. The Federalists believed in a strong central government, while the Democratic Republicans believed in a weaker central government with more power in the states. They also had different population bases that they were serving. The Federalists served more of an urban-based population, whereas the Democratic Republicans had a more agricultural-based population base. There we go. When we really started to see the division was when Alexander Hamilton introduced his financial plan, the plan to get us out of debt. Now, he had 3 key points that he wanted to do. He wanted to raise revenue for the country, which is going to be done through tariffs and excise taxes. He wants to create a national bank. But the first thing he wants to do before any of that is combine all the debt that was accrued during the American Revolution. States had debt and the national government had debt. He wanted to combine all that debt and then reissue it. And what that meant was he was going to reissue bonds or renegotiate the terms of these loans in order to buy some time in order to get them paid off. He's essentially going to start paying everyone we owed interest until we could raise enough revenue to start paying off the loans. And then he's going to place tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imports. And so what that is good for is American industry, because tariffs make foreign goods more expensive. So people are more often going to buy a less expensive good that was made in America. The more American goods you can sell, the more manufacturing grows, and then that becomes another taxable base going forward. So Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, believed that manufacturing and commerce was the way to build the economy in our country. Jefferson, Madison are going to have big problems with the financial plan because they believe it's overstepping the authority of the executive branch in the Constitution. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says anything about establishing a bank. What they are accusing Hamilton of, and others who follow him, is a loose interpretation of the Constitution. James Madison said, listen, I wrote this dog. I know what it says, and what it says is what it says. There is no gray area. There is no reading between the lines and trying to figure out what we meant when we wrote this. And so we want a strict interpretation, and there is nothing about the bank in the Constitution. That said, this is an unconstitutional move. You cannot do this, Hamilton. Hamilton's going to say, no, it's absolutely constitutional. There's the necessary and proper clause, which says anything necessary and proper to govern the United States can be under the authority of Congress. So he goes, that gives me the authority to create a national bank. So here we go. We got the Federalists arguing with the Democrat Republicans, and all this is going on, and finally a compromise is made. And the compromise essentially got Jefferson and Madison to agree to support Hamilton's plan if Hamilton agreed to move the capital to the southern portion of our country. And that's what happened, and that's how Washington, D.C. became our nation's capital. But that doesn't mean that everyone is lovey-dovey again within the Washington's cabinet. Hamilton and Jefferson are going to be at each other the entire time. The big first conflict that has to be dealt with, though, as a country is the Whiskey Rebellion. A lot of farmers in western Pennsylvania are upset because of the whiskey tax that Alexander Hamilton, his plan, created. And so they're going to revolt against the tax, because that's what we do in America. If there's a tax, we revolt against it. And a bunch of farmers are going to rise up. George Washington is going to call in the military. The military is going to go. When the military shows up in western Pennsylvania, the farmers are like, oh, dog. That's a lot of soldiers. And they took off running. So the rebellion just kind of died off. But what it showed us was the power of the Constitution, that it did work and the mechanisms within it did work. And so it was going to work going forward. So that's important. Okay? So that was kind of like what was going on domestically with Washington and his presidency. But he also has to deal with foreign countries. And he has to essentially first thing deal with is what's going on over in France. France is our biggest ally, and now they have a revolution going on. Jefferson's like, we got to get in there. We got to go help them because they helped us in our revolution. And Hamilton's like, we can't go over there. We don't got any money. Don't do it. And besides, we should make friends with England. We don't want to be friends with France. And so here's Hamilton and Jefferson at it again. Washington has to make the decision, and in 1793, he issues the Neutrality Proclamation that says, listen, we don't want to get involved in your wars, but we want to be friends with you. We want to trade with you. We want an economic relationship with you, but we really don't want a political relationship with you. And so the Neutrality Proclamation is going to become our foreign policy, and neutrality is going to be America's foreign policy for the next 150 years or so, up until World War II. That we're always trying to maintain our neutrality. So that's kind of, there were several different treaties that are going to be signed during Washington's presidency. You're going to have the Pinckney's Treaty. You're going to have Jay's Treaty. You might want to be familiar with those. But Washington is going to leave after his second term. He's going to set that precedent. And upon leaving, in his farewell address, he's going to give some warnings. He's going to say, don't form any political parties, which, that already happened. He said, don't accrue any debt. Well, that's already happened too. He said, don't get involved in any foreign entanglements. Well, we're doing all right with that, pretty good. And he said, respect the Constitution. Well, that's going to usher us into our next president, John Adams. And John Adams, I don't know if he read the farewell address. I don't know if he read Washington's advice, because he's going to kind of ignore all of that. So during his presidency, he's still dealing with the problems with France. France is at war. France is mad at us because we are not getting involved in the war. And so what they're going to do is they're going to start attacking our merchant ships. We're going to have to send out our naval ships to deal with that, which leads us to what's known as the quasi-war. The quasi-war was an unofficially declared war, or undeclared unofficial war we had with France. And we fought this for 2 years. It was a naval war. Trying to bring this war to an end, Adams is going to send representatives over to France to try to negotiate a peace. This is going to result in what is called the XYZ affair. When our ministers got over there, they were approached by the French, and the French said, you got to pay us before you're even going to talk to anybody about peace. And essentially, they're bribing us. They're like, you give us a bunch of money, and then we can talk. Our guys said, oh, heck no. And they came back to America, and Adams was like, heck, I'm not going to give you 2 cents. Instead, I'll fight a war with you. And that's what we did. And Adams he was revered for this. They were like, cool, because everybody, Federalists were happy with him. Democratic Republicans were happy with this because no one's going to push us around. Now, eventually, he is going to negotiate a peace, but the XYZ affair is kind of like that good part of Adams' presidency. Sometimes I say there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. The XYZ was the good part of his presidency. But let's get to the bad and the ugly part. What we're going to see happen is Adams is fearing a lot of dissent in the country. He's worried that people who support the French are going to start rising up and causing problems. And that dogs are doing something weird. And that's going to lead to the passage of the Alien Acts and the passage of the Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts were laws that were passed to control immigration in our country. That's going to give the executive branch power that if there's any security threats that they see to our country, they can deport those aliens or those non-citizens from our country. It's also going to extend the immigration period or the citizenship period, or the residency period that you have to live here before you can become a citizen. It went from 5 to 14 years. That was kind of bad, but here's the ugly, the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act basically said, we're not going to tolerate any, oh my goodness, what's going on here? These young people, young people. This is going to result in the Sedition Act that essentially said that any negative speak about the government in the press is forbidden. And so this will lead to a big pushback from some of the Democratic Republicans, specifically Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, when they wrote the Virginia and the Kentucky Resolution. What these two resolutions essentially said was that any law passed by the federal government that is unconstitutional can be nullified by the states. And the debate at this point was who had the power to interpret the Constitution. And what Jefferson and Madison are saying is it's the states. They're the ones who have the power to determine whether or not laws are constitutional. And they didn't feel like the sedition law was constitutional, so essentially they're going to say the states have the right to nullify that law. And the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions are going to become a basis for arguments against future laws in our country. They're also going to become a basis for secession later as we get closer and closer to the Civil War. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, here's the last big idea. What does this say? Hit it again, Lennox. The presidencies of Washington and Adams set precedents for the way America would behave regarding the relationship between the federal government and state governments, economic policy, and foreign policy. Everything we just talked about basically laid the foundation for what would be our country going forward. The precedents that Washington set, the examples even that Adams, of what to do and what not to do. We're going to see that grow over time, and we're going to see their influence grow over time. With regards to foreign policy, the one thing I didn't talk about was the Native Americans. Native Americans are considered foreign policy issues because they are their own nations. One thing that happened during this time that you probably read about in your book, I know we didn't talk about it in class, was the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. What this essentially said was it regulated the relationships that existed among the settlers and the Indians, and then it made provisions for fair dealings between the two. Westward migration was starting to take off in our country. Once the English are gone, I mean, they're still in the forts, and we'll talk about that later, but Americans are moving westward, and so they had to do something to deal with the Native Americans, and that's what the Trade and Intercourse Act is going to do, is kind of set a guideline for how we're going to get along going forward. Slavery is going to start growing as a result of this. The further we go west, the more slavery is going to become incumbent in the economy of the southern states. You're going to start to see a division in our country. You're going to start seeing sectionalism grow as a result of all this. But all of that, my friends, is for our next unit of discussion. So I'm going to come back to you here. I'm going to move this over here. And I'm going to open it up for real questions now that you might have as far as getting ready for tomorrow's exam. We've been talking for what now? A little over an hour. And so now an hour and 8 minutes is how long we've been going. So do you guys have any questions that I can answer? Something I might not have touched on, something that might be in your review that I didn't hit. I know there's a lot in this unit. There's a lot to talk about. Okay, I don't understand why these are coming. Listen, guys, we got some problems with some spam coming in here, and I apologize for that. This is the one problem doing this live, is you never know who's going to jump on. Last time we didn't have any problems. This time we do have problems coming in, and apparently some people don't have anything to do with their lives except just jump on live U.S. history reviews, so that's kind of sad right there. Anyway, do you have any questions I can answer, any comments or anything like that have to do with the test you're taking tomorrow, and not just because you're bored and have no life? So let me throw that out there, and if anybody wants to jump on, if I start having a bunch of spam come in, I might have to call it good. But I am here and opening it up for questions for you. The dogs are here waiting to see if you guys come up with anything that I can answer. So go ahead and drop them in there, and let me take some water and relax for a second. I'm not seeing anything yet. Can I move this over here? There we go. That's a better view. All right. Don't forget, for my students who are watching, the structure of the test tomorrow. That's a great question, Connor. There really wasn't, as far as with the Native Americans, with regards to the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. I think, honestly, everybody was just, once you're going out west, expansion was important. Now, the Democratic Republicans, they probably viewed expansion a little bit more importantly because they are finding, the further west they have, the more agricultural land there is. So, they're definitely supporting expansion, but they also want the government to protect them from the Native Americans. As I've mentioned before, honestly, the American attitude towards the Native Americans was just get out of our way. Let us go ahead and move out there. Like I said, they did pass that Trade and Intercourse Act that, like I said, set up a relationship and set up for some fair dealings. But you realize that the further west we go, the fair dealings just go out the window. So, long answer to your great question. There really wasn't a difference in their attitudes towards the Native Americans. They pretty much both felt the same way on that. So, great question, though. What else? Oh, not a whole lot coming in. This light up here is kind of bright. Come here, Gil. Difference between the first quartering act, second quartering act. Honestly, Adrian, there's not a lot of difference. They both did the same thing. The second quartering act of the coercive acts was placed in there primarily because more soldiers are coming over. So the first quartering act was put in place after the proclamation line of 1763, and they had to bring in more soldiers, or they didn't actually bring them in. These are soldiers that fought in the war and just stayed here. They didn't go back, so they needed a place to quarter them, and so that's the first quartering act. The second quartering act was more soldiers, we need more room. So that's all it was. And the second quartering act in the coercive acts, that's more for Boston. Because remember, the coercive acts were focused more on punishment towards the Boston area due to the Tea Party. So the men Bostonians, they got to house them. The Democratic Daxton, no, the modern day Democrats and Republicans are going to evolve differently. The Democratic Republicans, are actually going to go down a different path. That's why I said to be careful with looking at political party names. Always look at their platforms and stuff like that. We're in a two-party system. That's the type of political system we have, and we've always had a two-party system. I think we are on right now our sixth or our seventh two-party system. So you're going to see a lot of evolution as we go through these next 200 years. It really, the modern day Democrats and Republicans honestly aren't going to really be in full existence until the late 1800s. Is when you really start to see, or mid to late 1800s. So we got a ways to go still. Okay, that's another good question. What else? My dogs are out barking at something. I think there must be a deer out there or something. So, okay. I hate that there's this delay while I'm waiting for questions to come up. So. All right. Well, we are at a minute or an hour and 15 coming up here. So if nothing else pops up real quick, I'm about to call it an evening. I think, guys, like I said, what we talked about tonight is the facts. So here we go. Yeah. Daxton, you're jumping all the way ahead to time period 5, and it wasn't that simple. No, I'm just going to say no, because you're going to see a split in parties. You're going to see other parties merge together. Man, this is kind of one of those, just wait and see, and trust me, you're going to find it fascinating in the moment. So focus on time period 3. Focus on that time period for this test tomorrow. How did the proclamation affect the relationship between the British? Michael, I'm not 100% sure what you're asking as far as that. Are you talking about the proclamation line of 63? And if so, the relationship between the British and who, I guess. It looks like there's something missing there. I'm gonna wait for you to put an answer there, but as I'm waiting, I'm just gonna explain that proclamation line is going to cause tension between the British and the colonists who are along that western frontier there, because the colonists thought they deserved the right to move west because they had fought alongside the British, and so they thought they should get the spoils of the war. So the proclamation line itself will create tension between the two groups. It's not going to create enough tension where you're going to see any protest or any type of boycotts or any type of rebelling. It's just going to kind of be like a little thorn in the side, like, man, the British just ticked me off again. And that's really one thing coming out of the French and Indian War, is this idea that we fought together, but there were some hard feelings after the war, because the British honestly were angry that they had to come and fight because they felt like they had to defend the colonists, and the colonists couldn't defend themselves. The colonists felt like they held their own, and they stood side by side with the British, and then the British just talked down to them. And then when this line goes up and more soldiers have to stay here, that creates more tension. And so obviously, that's not going to help the relationship. But in 1763, we're still 14 years or 13 years away from declaring independence. So this is just one small step. I guess you can call it the first step, if you will, towards independence, but there's still a long path that they have to go down. Sorry, talking for an hour, losing my voice. Okay, a super court justice, Supreme Court justice, and used by Abraham Lincoln and President Grant to describe the judicial branch, which is great, but that was not the quiz question yesterday, Daxon. Let it go, okay? The Constitution, it was supported by the Federalists. So if I had to guess, I would say that the Constitution was more of a Federalist creation. But remember, the Anti-Federalists fought for the individual rights, and that was the whole debate to get it ratified. Jefferson wasn't there, but if Jefferson had been there, he probably would not have been, he wasn't happy with the Constitution because it did create a strong central government, and that was a fear of the Anti-Federalists, but then later it's also going to be a fear of the Democratic Republicans. But Brooks, I would honestly say that if you had to pick one, I would say the Constitution primarily followed the Federalist perspective of government. That said, James Madison wrote it, and James Madison will later become a Democratic Republican. So, there are parts that both sides could use and both sides respect it. So, use that for what you will, okay? I don't know what the dogs are barking at. I'm going to mute this just for a second while I yell at them. Hang on. Okay, I'm back. All right, guys, any other questions? Good boy. Good listen. Any other questions I can answer for you guys before we call it a night? These are good questions. Even yours, Dax. So. All right. Gilligan, you want to get up here and say hello? We'll get up here? All right, here comes Gilligan. Gilligan's going to come up and say hello to you guys and wish you guys luck on the exam tomorrow. Yes, he's a good boy. Flint is out chasing deer right now, so I don't think he's going to come in and say goodnight to you guys. But he was here earlier. He was at my feet the entire time. So he has absolute faith that you guys are going to do great tomorrow. I do too. We talked about how Jefferson Madison wrote how did this affect the eventual Jefferson election? I don't know. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know how it had an effect on the election. The Virginia and the Kentucky resolution were more regional resolutions. It wasn't like a national resolution, so I don't know that it actually gained much national traction from that. What I do know is that Jefferson is going to be elected with, most of the southern states the southern states which were more agricultural based, and we're seeing the agricultural section of our country growing faster than the manufacturing part of it. So, I don't know that the Kentucky and Virginia resolution played a role. It might have gotten him some more support from those states though. So, hang on just a second. I'm gonna get the dog real quick. Check out this picture for a second. I'll be right back. Okay, there we go. Sorry, the mic couldn't come back on. So apparently there's an entire herd of deer in my backyard right now. So, all right. Let's see. Your question was immaculate, and I was right, and Drake May will own the Bills for the... Oh, my gosh. Daxon, really carefully remember, I grade your exam, and I have all this in writing now, so I have proof, because this never goes away. Thank you, Adrian. All right, Fatima. SAQ, will it be a summarized question? It's going to, Fatima, the SAQ will be part of Unit 3. It's not going to be a summarized question, but it'll be from part of Unit 3. So in all honesty, SAQs, anything is game. But you know the structure of the SAQ. It's going to be the structure kind of like the one we looked at today, where you have 3 parts to a question. All 3 parts are going to be about a specific topic from this unit. I'm glad it was helpful. What is the main thing you need to know? You better study if that's what you're asking. All right, so Drake May is taking us off the rails, so I take that. If no one else has any other questions, I'm going to call it a night. I have to go get this herd of deer out of my yard so my dog stops going crazy. Literally, there's 6 deer out there right now, so let me go take care of that. And Daxon, I love your optimism. Let me just end with that. If you bring that kind of optimism into the exam tomorrow, you are going to ace this test. And Drake Bay's not going to be able to help you at all. So get out there and get studying. But guys, that's going to be it for me. I hope you have a great evening. I hope this was helpful. I'm going to go ahead and shut this down and ask you guys to have a very good evening. Take some time, study, review your notes. There's some videos online if you want to watch some shorter videos for topics 3.2 through 3.9. I didn't get 3.10 up. I'm sorry about that. But other than that, guys, have a fantastic evening, and we will see you on the other side. Good night.